Lost Highways from History Colorado is made possible by the Sturm Family Foundation, proud supporters of the humanities and the power of storytelling for more than 20 years.
And by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, exploring the human endeavor.
It's really funny. We laughed a lot when we first read it. Mm-hmm. The pictures are hilarious. The bed is some sort of sacred tomb, not tomb, but
coffin sort of thing. Because he just decides what all these things are. He just makes up random assumptions.
Meet Ellery and Hadley. They're 12 and 10 years old, respectively, and they're the daughters of historian Jason Hansen, the chief creative officer here at History Colorado. Hi, Jason.
Hey, Noel.
If you've listened to Lost Highways before, you've probably heard Jason's name in the credits. He oversees all kinds of creative work here at the museum, including the podcast. And Jason recently gave his daughters a copy of one of his favorite books from when he was a kid, one of the books that he credits for his love of history. It's called Motel of the Mysteries. And tell me, if you would, Jason, a little bit about this book.
So, Motel of the Mysteries was written by an illustrator named David McCulley in 1979. And the basic idea is that in the mid-1980s, life in the United States ended catastrophically, buried under some sort of absurd Pompeii-esque avalanche of junk mail and suddenly solidified air pollution.
A book that every father should give his children.
Well, it's actually sort of a wry comedy. The mass extinction is just prelude, and the focus of the story is a bumbling buffoon of an amateur archaeologist named Howard Carson. In the year 4022, he stumbles upon the well-preserved ruins of a budget motel called, if you can believe it, the Tutankhamun Motel.
all these things we have today that seem so normal to us are like, he doesn't even know what they are. He doesn't know what a telephone is, a bathtub. He doesn't know what a bed or a toilet is.
One of our favorite parts of the book is when the bumbling archaeologist determines that a toilet seat is part of a sacred burial ritual.
It's a necklace or
It's a collar.
collar.
And he has the seat part around his neck and the lid behind his head and the headband that keeps the toilet seat together in hotels around his head, connecting the toilet lid to his head.
Will you ever look at a hotel the same way again?
No.
So why was this book so formative for you?
Motel of the Mysteries is a send-up of archaeology and the presumptions that archaeologists make about the past from nothing more than a few artifacts. It really cuts straight to a question at the heart of all of my work and really all of history. Whether you're digging up the distant past or a journalist trying to report the facts of the story, how do we know what we know? And what happens when what we think we know changes?
From History Colorado Studios, this is Lost Highways, Dispatches from the Shadows of the Rocky Mountains. I'm Noel Black.
And I'm Jason Hansen. On this episode, we'll explore one of the key questions Americans are asking themselves in these days of competing facts, when it seems that for every expert out there working hard to make sense of our world, there's an equal and opposite expert, and anyone can do their own research in ways that often seem to confirm what they wanted to believe all along. We'll look at the way that historians and archaeologists and others who study the past know what they say they know. Where does that confidence come from? How confident are they, actually?
And we're going to do it by taking you to one of North America's most spectacular places, and the site of a mystery that has vexed Western archaeologists for generations. Mesa Verde National Park in southwestern Colorado.
Mesa Verde was home to many ancestral Puebloan communities who lived there for more than 1,000 years, before leaving the area pretty abruptly around the year 1300.
For nearly a century and a half, archaeologists have been studying Mesa Verde in hopes of deciphering what happened to the people who lived and so clearly thrived there for so long.
For many, it remains one of the great mysteries in the history of North America.
Although, as we'll hear later, for many Pueblo people, the decision to abandon Mesa Verde is not a mystery unto itself, but rather an episode that fits into their much longer history throughout what is today the U.S. Southwest.
If you've never been to Mesa Verde or seen pictures, it's truly one of the most fascinating architectural wonders you're ever going to see. The ruins of multi-story homes, underground ceremonial spaces called kivas, and other buildings dot the landscape. The most well-known is Cliff Palace, which is a stone city built into an alcove on the side of a sheer cliff.
Picture a small, ancient yellow brick city in the middle of a giant sandstone sandwich. When you first see it, you immediately wish you could live there, and you can't help but find your mind climbing in and out of the little plazas and rooms before you even begin to walk through.
The last time we took a family trip to Mesa Verde, as I watched my daughters climbing around the ancient structures, I couldn't help feeling an echo of the children who had lived here centuries ago. And I couldn't help imagining them playing with one of my favorite artifacts from Mesa Verde, which we have on exhibition at the History Colorado Center in Denver. Well, I brought you here because people ask me what my favorite artifact is in the museum, and I usually give some diplomatic answer. It's like choosing a child. I love them all for different reasons equally. But if you press me, I will tell you that this right here is my favorite artifact in the museum. It's this tiny, tiny little ladle.
Can I describe this artifact?
I would love it.
So what we're looking at is...
This is Holly Norton, Colorado's state archaeologist, deputy state historic preservation officer, and a friend who, when she's not out in the field, works just down the hall from me.
So what we're looking at is this little ladle. It's about 2 inches long. The handle is very short. The handle is maybe only about 3/4 of an inch. It's less than half of the length of the ladle totally. And the cup of the ladle is pretty large, a little bit over an inch it looks like. But what's interesting is there's also a miniature ladle next to it that's a little bit bigger. This little one, Jason's favorite, is almost crude.
It doesn't look like much. I would bet that most people walk right past it.
I would bet so too.
The reason I love it so much is, on the label it says that archaeologists think that this may have been a children's toy. I have 2 daughters at home, and when they were little, they had kitchen toys. I feel like this is the exact same thing. Like, I can imagine the parent at Mesa Verde being like, would you please just go play with your toys? I have to get some stuff done before the end of the night. Like, I have to get dinner ready, whatever it is.
One of the things that strikes me about it is not only may it be a toy, but also on this label, it says it could have been a children's creation. Right? So then there's 2 ways that a child may have been playing with this, both imitating their parents in the kitchen like our kids do, potentially even helping in some way. I know my 8-year-old kiddo has been helping us make dinner more and more, which is really fun and also really terrifying because there's knives and heat involved.
To me, this is just the item in this museum that fulfills the promise that artifacts have, that they can connect us across a millennia.
I actually really love that this is your favorite artifact and that you're seeing this connection and like just how there's this humanity about parents and their children, regardless of how we think of them.
Yeah, so
After we looked at the ladle together, Holly and I went upstairs to History Colorado's recording studio to talk more about how we can know what we think we know about this tiny little ladle. But first, I asked Holly to set straight whatever skewed ideas I had about archaeology. Because before I knew real archaeologists like Holly, my understanding of their work came mainly from Motel of the Mysteries and, of course, Indiana Jones, who as a kid growing up in the 80s was a model for what I wanted to do when I grew up. I thought that archaeology, when it was done right, was mostly dashing curators in leather jackets, discovering treasures in secret crypts, something like this newsreel from the 1950s.
In the famed Valley of the Kings, where 60 Egyptian pharaohs were buried midst a splendor the world has never equaled, archaeologists complete 3 years of painstaking excavation. Under 150 feet of sand and rock, they discover the ancient tomb of Mentemhet, Prince of Thebes. Mentemhet was governor of Upper Egypt 700 years before Christ. The mummy of a priest...
Holly said that Hollywood got it right, that early archaeologists were often white men from Europe in the United States. But beyond that, the real history of archaeology was a lot less romantic and dirtier.
There is a lot of emphasis on digging because when archaeology really kind of got started 150 years ago, people were out literally kind of trying to dig up treasures and dig up shiny, cool, pretty things that they could usually bring back to their patrons.
The thrill of the find, especially when it was something shiny or made its finder internationally famous, might have been the initial attraction. But it wasn't long before archaeologists started looking beneath the shiny surface.
pretty quickly, I think the people who were so fascinated by these objects realized that they could tell a bigger story than just being shiny and cool.
The first question, the most basic question, which anyone who has ever discovered a family heirloom they didn't know about, or even a rusty old beer can in the woods, has probably asked, was, when is this from?
And that's really a fundamental question of archaeology even today. When did these people live? When were they using these objects?
Careful excavation through different layers of soil reveals the past in reverse order.
Stuff that's deeper in the ground is older than stuff that's closer to the surface. And so that kind of starts giving us some relative ideas.
In the Southwest, archaeologists can dial in on an artifact's age more precisely by using a technique called dendrochronology.
It's a technique that uses the concentric rings you see when you cut through a tree trunk, which show the tree's growth, thicker in wet years when a lot of rain fell and thinner in dry years, to build a timeline back into the past.
In the Southwest, the dry climate preserved the wooden beams ancestral Puebloan people used in their buildings. Eventually, this allowed archaeologists to match up tree ring patterns to build a record that stretches back more than 2,000 years into the past.
Thanks in large part to the tree ring record, archaeologists have been able to determine that people lived in the Mesa Verde region continuously in settlements from at least 400 BCE, which is often referred to as BC, to almost 1300 CE, which you will also hear called 1300 AD.
And once archaeologists felt confident that they were able to answer the first question, when, they moved on to more complex questions.
How were they organized? Did they have governments the way we think of governments? Did they have hierarchies? How did they get their food? And that's not just a subsistence question, but that's a social organization question. If you've got people who are devoting their time to making that beautiful black and white pottery that we saw downstairs, who's feeding them? How is that working? Is it nuclear families or is it something else?
Mesa Verde is about a 45-minute drive from Durango, or 15 minutes from nearby Cortez, or a little farther if you're staying at the Ute Mountain Ute Casino in Toyac.
Spanish explorers called it Mesa Verde, which means green table, because it's an enormous flattened mountain topped with thick growths of green juniper and pinyon trees.
From aerial views, it looks like an outcropping of the San Juan Mountains was scraped flat about halfway up. Drainages cut through the mesa everywhere, running roughly from north to south to flow into the Mancos River, creating a web of deep canyons that give Mesa Verde a dramatic topography.
It's in those canyons, in recessed alcoves eroded into the otherwise sheer rock walls, that the ancestral Puebloans built the spectacular settlements that captured the imaginations of those who see them. Again, the most famous is Cliff Palace, the large complex built into a canyon overhang near the center of the mesa.
It was built beginning around 1200, and at its peak in the latter half of the 1200s, more than 600 people likely lived there.
Cliff Palace is just one of nearly 5,000 ancestral Puebloan sites archaeologists have identified throughout Mesa Verde National Park.
But there are many more, about 18,000 throughout the wider region, and that includes more cliff dwellings, settlements on the mesa top, towers, temples, dams, and water systems, and farming structures.
When Theodore Roosevelt designated Mesa Verde as a national park in the summer of 1906, it was just the 7th national park in the United States.
Previous parks, like Yellowstone, Yosemite, and Mount Rainier, had been created to preserve their natural splendor. Any people who had lived there were treated like incidental inconvenience to the spectacular scenery that was worth protecting.
But at Mesa Verde, the people were the reason to preserve the place. It was the first national park to be established to preserve its human history, rather than allegedly untrammeled nature.
Its creation is a fascinating story of its own right.
The abbreviated version is that the Ute people, whose origin stories say they had always lived in that area, of course knew about the people who had lived there centuries before, and the ruins they left behind. And others who had spent time in the area, trappers and surveyors and explorers and ranchers, had encountered some of the evidence that others had lived there long before.
Settlers' awareness of the ruins remained within these small circles until 1888, when two white American ranchers named Richard Wetherill and Charles Mason were guided to Cliff Palace by a Ute man named Akowitz.
We can start the story with the Wetherells.
This is Jared Orsi. He's a member of Colorado's State Historians Council and a professor of history at Colorado State University, where he is also the director of the Public and Environmental History Center.
Richard Wetherell was a rancher in the area, and he located Mesa Verde's some of its ruins that interested him in 1888, and he told other people, and a lot of local people began to come and visit the site.
Richard Wetherell and his 4 brothers, plus his brother-in-law, Charlie Mason, worked on their Alamo Ranch near the small town of Mancos, just a few miles northeast of Mesa Verde.
When they could, the Wetherell brothers would explore the ruins they found in Mesa Verde. They were well-read men, and they kept up with the latest scientific discoveries of the day. They brought a more archaeological sensibility to their explorations than the souvenir pot hunters and more organized looters who came out and took whatever artifacts they found. The Wetherells did their best to document their finds while lobbying the Smithsonian in Washington to protect the site.
Even though they were doing their best to approach their explorations in a scientific manner and documenting their finds, they still removed them from where they found them, offering them to museums for research and education, as was common practice for archaeologists at the time.
They sold some of their early finds to the Colorado Historical Society in the 1880s and 90s, creating one of History Colorado's foundational collections. In fact, the ladle Jason loves dates to some of those early acquisitions from the Wetherells and a few others who were also active in the region.
In the winters, when the work was slower on the ranch, the Wetherells started leading tours to the area.
As word got out, people came from farther and farther away to see the ruins of Mesa Verde with their own eyes.
There was a Swedish archaeologist. His name was Gustav Nordenskjöld.
Gustav Nordenskjöld was a Swedish nobleman with an interest in science. He came to study the ruins at Mesa Verde in 1891 and worked with the Wetherells to conduct what was, up until then, the most professional and extensive archaeological survey of the area.
Ultimately, despite some locals trying to arrest him for looting as he boarded a train in Durango to leave, he returned to Sweden with hundreds of artifacts, as well as the remains of 20 people who had been buried near settlements on Mesa Verde.
Nordenskjöld's collection eventually ended up in the National Museum of Finland, though the museum recently returned the remains of the 20 people he had taken from Mesa Verde to a coalition of Pueblo tribes. Many of the items he collected have been in Helsinki ever since.
Prompted by the lack of any legal means to prevent Nordenskjöld from removing artifacts, and in general by the fears that the ruins of Mesa Verde would be, well, ruined by day-tripping souvenir hunters and more organized looters, some Coloradans began campaigning to protect the historic sites.
The most effective advocates were a dedicated group of Colorado women.
2 Colorado women, Lucy Peabody and Virginia McClurg, were very interested in making sure that the lands were preserved. They looked at all of this collecting and they saw it as unsustainable, and that after a while there'd be nothing left if private people went to Mesa Verde, took the best stuff, even damaged the ruins perhaps to facilitate ranching or farming or other activities. And so they organized people in Colorado and in the Four Corners area and began to press for a land reserve.
Eventually, Congress and President Theodore Roosevelt agreed with the ladies of the Colorado Cliff Dwellings Association that Mesa Verde should be protected. Although McClurg had wanted the park to be under local control and run by her organization, Roosevelt was on a nationwide conservation kick and designated Mesa Verde National Park in 1906.
But there was an important caveat.
Much of the land designated for the national park was actually sovereign tribal land. It was part of the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation, which was created a decade earlier when a band of Utes had refused to agree to have their land broken up and allotted for homesteading.
As you can imagine, many members of the tribe were less than enthusiastic about the creation of a national park that demanded more land from them.
It wasn't until 5 years later that the federal government negotiated a land swap with the tribe to ensure that the entire park was on federal land, a transaction that created hard feelings among many Ute Mountain Ute people at the time, and still does for some today.
Despite ceding the land for the park, the Ute Mountain Ute retained many ancestral Puebloan sites on their reservation. Alongside the national park today is the Ute Mountain Tribal Park, which is more than twice as big as Mesa Verde. Only accessible with a tribal guide, it contains ancestral Puebloan sites that rival those in the national park and offers visitors more intimate tours informed with tribal knowledge.
But most people visit the national park.
Today, more than 500,000 people from around the globe visit the park each year to learn about the ancestral Puebloan people who called it home a millennia ago.
Which brings us back to our original question. What do those visitors learn? What do we know about the people who called Mesa Verde home? And can visitors today be any more certain that archaeologists and historians know what they know about the site and the people who live there?
Who are the Pueblo people? Well, the single most defining characteristic of Pueblo Indian culture is that they were farmers, and their primary crop was maize or corn.
This is Mark Varian. He's been doing archaeological work in the U.S. Southwest since Motel of the Mysteries was published in 1979. Though he recently retired, he did much of his work at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center near Cortez, just outside Mesa Verde National Park.
The earliest dated corn in the Four Corners is from Black Mesa in northeastern Arizona, and it dates about 4,000 years ago. More in the central Mesa Verde region, there's some dates that are pretty early, but not that early. And it looks like it's not until about 400 BC that the first permanent farmers move and stay settled in the region. And there's relatively continuous occupation in that larger central Mesa Verde region from 400 BC until the end of the AD 1200s.
Over those centuries, people built settlements all around the region, throughout southwestern Colorado and southeastern Utah. And by the 1200s, it was a bustling place.
There was a population peak in the mid-1200s where the central Mesa Verde region, right here where I live in Cortez, Colorado, had as many people then as it does today.
The population of Montezuma County in the southwest corner of Colorado today is about 24,500, which is around the same population that archaeologists believe lived in the region in the 1200s. As a point of comparison, that's similar to the size of London, Lisbon, Verona, Copenhagen, and Prague during the 13th century. But the growth didn't last at Mesa Verde.
And it was only a few decades after that peak that the migrations were completed, and virtually all the Pueblo people had moved from the region as an area of permanent residence.
Some of the most compelling work that Mark Varian and his colleagues did at Crow Canyon was the Village Ecodynamics Project.
Gustav Nordenskjold and other early archaeologists used the best archaeological tools and practices available to them around the turn of the 20th century. Mark Varian and his colleagues were building new tools for modern archaeologists.
The essence of it was to use the most advanced technology available to conduct what's called agent-based simulations.
Essentially, the Village Ecodynamics Project, which Mark sometimes refers to as the VEP, gathered all the data available about the more than 18,000 archaeological sites documented since the first expeditions in the region, fed it all into a big database, and then ran computer simulations to test different variables and scenarios.
So we did a computer simulation of ancestral Pueblo families living on the landscape in southwestern Colorado. Using the tree ring reconstructions of climate and the soils, we could estimate how their agricultural yields changed from year to year. So we created a simulation where we started in AD 600, and the simulation had all these different variables, and the variables were actions by the simulated Pueblo households.
The simulation was testing what would happen depending on what different decisions ancestral Puebloan people made.
The variables in the program were what people might have done in a given set of circumstances, and what the consequences might be. For instance, the archaeologists could estimate how much corn and other crops ancestral Puebloan people could grow in a given year, based on tree ring data about how much rainfall there was that year.
Then, they could run a simulation for dry years, when crop yields were low, and people may have had to rely more on hunting for food. And that would give the archaeologists some ideas about what long-term ramifications might have been for wildlife populations in the region as well.
Could run the simulation 500 different ways, combining all of those things, which included many things that would be virtually impossible to observe archaeologically, but nonetheless would have been critical to Pueblo people living on that landscape.
Then they checked the different outcomes from the simulation against the archaeological record they had from those 18,000 sites. That way, they could see which simulations fit with what they could observe about where people had lived at different times.
The Village Ecodynamics Project took archaeological information and applied modern computing power to process that information in ways that have given us new insights into the past.
And that's what's given archaeologists a lot of confidence to say they know things like about how many people were living in specific settlements during a particular time, and that most people abandoned the region by around 1300.
It also allows archaeologists to say with confidence how often rains were below average, when the drought got really bad, and how low their crop yields would have been during those times. But it still doesn't fully explain why everyone left the Mesa Verde region around 1300.
The data shows that people had weathered droughts that were as bad or worse in the region before. During those periods, some people left, reducing the population to a more sustainable size, and then the population rebounded when the rains returned. So why didn't they follow that tried and true strategy again at the end of the 1200s?
We were actually discussing that in the car coming out here. Is nobody knows, nobody seems to know exactly what happened, but the theory that we've kind of developed on our own is just, I guess, the
environmental changes and how to resource.
Yeah, the natural resources and things like that probably just kind of dried up for them, and
drought kind of.
Yeah.
I was telling my husband, like, if you build this awesome balcony or house or whatever,
why would you want to leave, right?
Yeah. I'm like, I worked so hard for this. I don't want to leave. So I really wonder why.
That was Minoru and Tomoko, two visitors to Mesa Verde on a recent summer day, telling us what they think happened to the people who had lived there before 1300. And this question about what happened is a big part of what's so compelling at Mesa Verde, the archaeological mystery. The cliff dwellings are like spectacular ghost towns, and Western archaeologists have long wondered why people who figured out how to adapt so brilliantly to their environment seem to have suddenly up and left. All the more so when Mark Varian explains that the available scientific evidence suggests that they could have stuck it out if they'd wanted to.
There are some theories, but those theories have changed over time, and the way they've changed is really fascinating.
The earliest Western archaeologists to study sites at Mesa Verde, like the Wetherills and Nordenskjold and others who came after them from institutions like the Smithsonian, found evidence that led them to conclude that war drove people away.
Here's Mark explaining it.
The very first Anglos to explore these ruins encountered some evidence that indicated that conflict was present.
Some of that evidence came from digging up the bodies of people who had died there centuries before, something that many early archaeologists did in the name of science without considering how offensive it was to their descendants.
Because they did excavate human remains, they found some evidence in those remains where it looked like bones had been harmed through conflict.
These early archaeologists also thought that the cliff dwellings looked like a natural castle, the type of place you would live if you were trying to make it very hard for someone to attack you.
They may have also seen the cliff dwellings as a defensive site location as well.
This, along with the discovery of human remains, led them to conclude that violence must have shaped the lives of ancestral Puebloan people during their final centuries at Mesa Verde.
At the end of the 1920s, new evidence emerged that really pushed aside the initial theories of warfare. As archaeologists filled in the record created by tree rings, it gave them the ability to reconstruct the rainfall data at Mesa Verde going back centuries. And that record revealed that a severe drought began about 1276 and lasted for decades. Mark Varian explains.
If you had evidence of the outside ring, you had evidence of the year that a human being harvested that tree to build a building. That person who created that first chronology identified the presence of an extreme drought that began in about AD 1276, and he labeled that the Great Drought and identified that as the basis for Pueblo people leaving the region.
So the record seemed to reveal that just as the population was peaking, a severe drought gripped the region. And it seemed self-evident to archaeologists that it explained why people left the area. Holly Norton articulates the simple logic this way.
There was a drought, and people were no longer to do subsistence agriculture. They were no longer able to consistently grow food, and so people outmigrated.
This conclusion, that the drought was a major factor in the depopulation of Mesa Verde, has prevailed among archaeologists for more than a century.
But over the decades, the drought theory morphed in important ways. New techniques allowed for more sophisticated analysis and reconstruction of the ancestral Puebloan environment over time. And that led many archaeologists to a new theory in the 1960s and 70s, that it wasn't just the drought. After all, people had survived droughts before at Mesa Verde. But that instead, the region experienced a more wide-ranging environmental collapse that forced people to leave.
Mark Varian explains that more evidence was found that seemed to suggest that centuries of intensive land use are to blame. Hunting, farming, cutting the trees, building settlements, and all the things that come with supporting a growing population ultimately overwhelmed the environment's ability to sustain the people.
One of the new facets of an interpretation that came into being probably in the 70s was resource depletion, that living on this land over so many centuries really changed the landscape and depleted the landscape to the point that that was a factor in people leaving.
But while archaeologists might be able to pinpoint when the drought began and the cascade of hardships that followed, they can't pinpoint a moment when people finally decided it was time to go.
More recently, some archaeologists have seen evidence that social inequality may have compounded the environmental challenges and played a larger role than previously recognized in prompting people to migrate. Holly explains.
There were some really deep social hierarchies in the Southwest and in places like Mesa Verde. If you are dealing with some climate change and environmental factors, and if you are maybe a little bit lower on the social ladder and you are working overtime to try to feed not only your own community, but these elites who are, producing pottery or governing your society, you might start having second thoughts about your place and your role in that. What are you getting back?
In other words, the social contract may have been broken.
Mark also sees ways that each of these explanatory frameworks might converge in mutually reinforcing ways, especially as the population grew larger than it had ever been before.
There wasn't enough to share in some of the bad years. So it's really these new forms of data collection and more sophisticated forms of data collection that bring these different factors that earlier folks had cited into a more holistic interpretation.
As one theory replaces another, the wildly different explanations for why ancestral Puebloan people left Mesa Verde around 1300 can feel like they're just guesses. But maybe there's another explanation that's been present all along.
Presentism is the idea that we interpret the past through the lens of our experience in the present. And if a historian uses the term, it's not likely that they're giving a compliment. As Jared put it,
presentism, if it comes out of the mouth of a historian, is a slightly derogatory term to describe excessive attention to present concerns and the allowing of those present concerns to color or even pollute our understanding of the past. When we evaluate people of the past according to the concerns that we have, even if it made no sense to them, that's anachronism. So we're making a statement that is out of time.
And the past, says Jared, exists on its own terms.
People of the past, whether we're talking about ancient Puebloans at Mesa Verde, or we're talking about Virginia McClurg and Lucy Peabody, or we're talking about park rangers from the 1950s, they operated at Mesa Verde around the concerns of their day. And those aren't the concerns of our day. And so you can imagine if historians start going back and interpreting in terms of what we care about today, then we would miss something about the past. We would misunderstand something.
Despite the best efforts of the many truly distinguished and brilliant archaeologists who have worked at Mesa Verde to understand what life was like for the people who lived there, and especially why they chose to leave, there's more than a whiff of presentism in the conclusions they came to.
In other words, the explanations that archaeologists have offered at different times for why people left Mesa Verde may say more about the times they're living in than the actual experience of ancestral Puebloan people in the late 1200s.
Consider that the first archaeologists at Mesa Verde saw evidence of violence and, in an era not far removed from the Civil War and careening through imperialistic wars like the Spanish-American War toward World War I, they concluded that warfare must have been what drove people away.
Thanks to tree ring dating, the evidence for the Great Drought emerged. But it's hard to miss the fact that it came into focus at the same time that the Dust Bowl settled in on the west, forcing farmers to leave their land in search of literal greener pastures.
It might just be coincidence that the tree ring record was finished right before the Dust Bowl began. But drought remained the consensus explanation for why people left Mesa Verde until the environmental movement in the United States gained traction in the 1960s and 70s.
And at that time, archaeologists started to see evidence that widespread resource depletion throughout the region had precipitated an environmental collapse that forced people to migrate.
And, more recently, theories about inequality eroding and dispersing ancestral Puebloan society seem to track with our own current heightened awareness of the toll of widespread inequality created by structural racism.
In other words, perhaps those who fail to learn the lessons of history aren't doomed to repeat them, but rather, those who try to learn the lessons of history so as not to repeat them are doomed to see the present.
I asked Mark Varian about this phenomenon. I'm wondering whether, as an archaeologist, you see those connections too, and whether it's, a case where we are creatures of our own culture and it informs how we see things, or whether it's just really the data is emerging and leading people to these conclusions.
We can't help but be creatures of our own culture and influenced by what's going on during the times in which we live. And yet, at the same time, we do try to independently evaluate the data that we collect. I think it's both. And I would also say, I think there is real truth to those pairings that you came between interpretations and things that have emerged in modern culture.
Holly Norton said something similar when I asked her about it.
We always make sense of the past related to the present. And I don't think that's anything to shy away from. Our changing views of the world and how we experience it and how we move through it actually allows us to ask different questions of the past.
But, says Holly, we have to be aware of the shortcomings of our own perspective, or at least humble enough to acknowledge that our perspective has shortcomings, whether or not we know exactly what they are.
If we walk through the world with certain assumptions about gender or sex or class or race, then that is going to color our research questions, and it's going to kind of color our analyses. It's going to make us not be able to see things that may have occurred in the past because we have these blindnesses.
And so, part of being a good archaeologist or historian or journalist is being aware of the blind spots and biases we may have.
You can't change the fact that you're a human being that has grown up in a specific culture and is living in a specific time. So what we're trained to do is realize that that does bias us and try to factor into our interpretations an evaluation of that bias. Is that imperfect? Yes, because we're humans, and it's a part of human imperfections in seeking this knowledge.
And anyway, he pointed out that while the connections I was seeing between the times in which archaeologists were living and the ways they interpreted the evidence about the past were real, I was also oversimplifying things, especially as I tried to pin presentist motivations on the archaeologists.
I'd also say that humans have always seen that violence and warfare has characterized modern times. It wasn't just the end of the Civil War. That's pretty much been, warfare and conflict has sort of been a constant of my lifetime.
The Western archaeologists who've studied Mesa Verde over the past century and a half have almost always been outsiders looking in, bringing their own perspective to whatever windows they're able to open on the past. No matter how much training and self-awareness they might bring to their work, it's just not possible to not bring their personal perspective of the world to how they see the evidence.
You've been talking to me, and I'm an archaeologist, but the people that we study are the ancestors of the modern Pueblo people. And modern Pueblo people have their own histories about all of this. I'm a gringo sort of trying to summarize this, and that's not the best thing in the world. The best thing would be to get a Pueblo person to talk to you about this.
My name is Matthew Martinez Sengitamo. I was born and raised in Okeawinge, where I served as former lieutenant governor for my tribe. And my formal title is Executive Director of the Mesa Prieta Petroglyph Project, which is a nonprofit in northern New Mexico aimed at stewardship and education of cultural sites.
The petroglyphs at Mesa Prieta, ancient images carved into the rocks, make the settlements at Mesa Verde seem like relatively recent history in comparison.
They were obviously examples of Indigenous people who traveled the Southwest, who left their stories for all of us to remind us of this very special and sacred place. We estimate that petroglyphs on the Mesa in northern Mexico date back at least 8,000 years or so. So there's a long legacy of travels and story making in the region, which is quite fascinating.
From Mesa Verde, you can travel south, generally following the migration route that most archaeologists believe people took when they left the region in the late 1200s. The Pueblo of Okeawinge, from where Matthew spoke to me, is located between Santa Fe and Taos. Tribal members traditionally speak Tewa, a language spoken by 6 of the contemporary Pueblo communities today.
Okeawinge was where the Spanish governor and conquistador Juan de Oñate established the first Spanish capital in Nueva Mexico, claiming it and renaming it San Juan de los Caballeros in 1598. It was also the birthplace of Pope, the mastermind of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 that successfully drove the Spanish out of the region for a dozen years.
So there's a large legacy of political and colonial empires in the region that our tribe has survived and continues to confront some of the challenges today.
Matthew Martinez says that the people of Okeawinge, like the people of each of the other Pueblo communities in New Mexico and Arizona today, recognize a connection with Mesa Verde. He explains that while Mesa Verde is a Spanish term,
in Tewa, we do have a name for this region. It's called Tewa Yoge. And we refer to these places all the time. And there's this, pretty popular narrative that people left the region. People left the Mesa Verde region and disappeared. And from Indigenous perspectives, we always believe that people never left these areas because they continue to be occupied in spirit and in memory. And our ancestors also left their breath, their cultural connections, so-called artifacts in the region that are very much alive. So there's life to them. And so we firmly believe that we've never left, and we continue to visit these places, to pay respects to all those that came before us.
Virgil Ortiz, an internationally renowned artist from Cochiti Pueblo who uses ceramics, costumes, photography, and film to explore an indigenous future 500 years after the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, feels the connection to his ancestors and their presence in the ceramics they left behind.
he says he felt that presence when we asked him to collaborate on an exhibition that put his futuristic pieces into a conversation with the historic Cochiti pieces and Ancestral Puebloan pieces in History Colorado's collection.
Well, the first time I went into your vault here, History Colorado, it blew my mind. I went in there and just you get chills right away because you feel that they're alive, the spirits around there, and thinking about all the people that have created them way back in who knows how long ago they created them without all the resources like running water or electricity or how in the heck did they do this? But that's what gives me strength and, prayer about guidance to continue that tradition. But to see pieces that are that old, all brought together and they're taken care of and everything, that's an amazing thing to see.
Virgil's manager, Tisha Goyo, is from Okeawinge. Her father, Herman Agoyo, devoted his life to reclaiming and sharing the history of the Pueblo Revolt, inspiring Virgil along the way. And she feels it too.
It's also sort of a very spiritual sense that I feel when I'm around that work. It's a very good feeling to see that and to know that it has survived, really. It just brings me a great sense of pride. It really does.
Virgil points out that many of the cultural connections between the ancestors at Mesa Verde in contemporary Pueblo communities persists today.
When you participate in, say, our feast day dances, like the women that wear their headdresses, the tablitas is what they call them, they have like a certain design element within the headdresses. And then they have like doorways and they're like in the shape of a T. Then you look at Mesa Verde or all of the different ruins, their doorways are like that too. They're like passageways. So like you can kind of start to put together old regalia, old ceremonial what we were while we do our dances, and then look at the actual buildings.
Virgil also feels that connection as he works with clay, especially the ceramics he makes in the traditional cochiti method.
When you touch the clay, you can feel all the people that have worked with clay before speaking to you. And it's like, I think all the people that have passed, all the spirits right now, all communicate. And that's where I always say that, like, it's not my talent that you see with the artwork that I put out there. I feel like I'm a conduit, always asking for guidance from our spirits and family members that have passed. I always also say it's like I'm just a bead in a necklace, but like the connections are they're always there.
And so what do modern Puebloan people think of the many theories that Western archaeologists have dreamt up for the last 150 years? What do the descendants of those who came south to what we know today as the current Pueblo communities in New Mexico and Arizona tell us about what happened at Mesa Verde around 1300?
It's important to note here that Pueblo people, like Western archaeologists and historians and really all people everywhere, don't always agree on everything. So there is not, quote, the Pueblo view of this.
But Matthew Martinez said there's some pretty clear consensus that the migration away from Mesa Verde fits within a much longer history of mobility in the region.
Pueblo belief systems is centered on migrations and survival. And so there's an understanding that there was a possible drought that pushed people out of certain regions and settled up along the present-day Rio Grande River, which is really based on agricultural practices. So that's really the connection of how people traveled in small bands all along, again, this northern corridor. We estimate that between 13 and 1500 is when you see the establishment of current-day Pueblo villages.
That timing for the establishment of the modern pueblos fits neatly with what archaeologists have discovered about when people left Mesa Verde and traveled south, eventually forming new communities.
Matthew underscored that movement of all kinds is part of Pueblo culture and has been for millennia, probably even since before people carved the petroglyphs at Mesa Prieta 8,000 years ago. And he understands the move away from Mesa Verde is part of that much broader experience.
One way to think about mobility is to really understand that movement is a part of life and it's ever continuous. And so whether that is a physical element and manifested moving from a village to another region and or through dance and cultural practices, there's continuous movement in traditions, in art forms, in language. Language is always fluid and there's always new concepts being added and defined. And so I think that's part of who we are as Pueblo people. There's a centered place surrounded by elements of movement, and it's both and. And I think it's really important to understand that these movement and migrations are really central to survival.
When my daughters were younger and more willing to play with analog toys, my wife and I took them on a family trip to Mesa Verde. And at one point in the afternoon, as I watched them hold hands and walk together down the path leading to the remnants of what had been another family's home more than 800 years before, I couldn't escape the feeling that there was some sort of human connection between us and the families who had called this place home. I thought of caretakers doing their best to raise their children and teach them all the things they would need to know as they grew up. And I thought of that little toy ladle back at the History Colorado Center and imagined children in that place playing with their toys and emulating the adults around them in some essentially similar way to how my daughters played with their own toys. I asked Jared Orsi if I was inappropriately projecting my own present-day life on the people of the past.
Human connection is a good thing. And so standing at Mesa Verde and knowing that you are not the same as the people who walked there 800 years ago, but that you share some traits and that divides a real and bonded connection, I think you're participating in something that human beings throughout history have done. That's why we study history and why we're interested in it, because we crave this connection to past peoples.
I think it's all real. I mean, you have to accept that, like when you have really weird deja vu is what they call it, or like you might have been from Mesa Verde. You don't know that if that touched you that closely, you could have been from there.
Virgil Ortiz says there are ways to discover those connections. For him, working with clay allows him to feel the presence of ancestors. But we can seek out opportunities to celebrate our common humanity, which is part of Pueblo culture today.
So if you look up different pueblos, they have each feast day that they invite people in. You could eat the food, the cuisine that, like, who knows how long we've been eating this type of food, and to enjoy the dances. If you have a chance to go see that, you can feel the power of all of our people all dancing in unison and singing together and asking prayer for not only us but the whole world. And that makes everybody realize that we're a lot more closely related than we are different.
Tish Agoyo agrees with Virgil. It's not hard to feel connected to one another and connected to something larger at a Pueblo dance.
That's a good suggestion, to find out when these dances are going on at the Pueblos and visit and experience that. And Pueblo people are very welcoming. They really are. They'll invite you over and give you a good meal, and that's what it's all about. I love that feeling.
I think about what is the larger human connection here, and regardless of our own particular background, there's something very innocent about kids playing outside in the mud, in the dirt, and kind of just being out with nature. And I think we lost sight of that as a society that's so consumed with technology. And so you take your kids, and I have a son as well, and there's almost something very magical and spiritual when they're able just to be out in their element and be outdoors and enjoy that and just be present. And I think that's just one of the oldest forms of human activity, is that connection that intersects across many cultures and communities globally.
For Matthew Martinez, there's something magical about that feeling. He told me we can know the people of the past, beyond simply what they did and when. And that knowledge begins with ourselves and our being open to connecting across time and culture.
Our bodies are made of majority water, right? And so there's, we feel certain things when we're walking the stream, and there's a conduciveness of movements, of water, and walking barefoot on dirt and sand. And it's just that reconnection as human people, as earth-based people around the world, that we're reminded of this. And I think that's what you're talking about. There's a reference point of that connectivity across peoples, for sure. Absolutely.
That's really cool.
It's beyond cool. It's magical.
Lost Highways is a production of History Colorado and History Colorado Studios. It's made possible by a generous grant from the Sturm Family Foundation, with particular thanks to Stephen Sturm and Emily Sturm, and by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, exploring the human endeavor. If you enjoyed this episode of Lost Highways and want to support it, please subscribe, rate us, and write us a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, tell a friend and share one of your favorite episodes. You can find links to individual episodes at historycolorado.org/Lost Highways. Many thanks to our producers Maria Jose Maddox and Dustin Hodge, and thanks to reporter Chris Clements at KSJD Public Radio in Cortez, Colorado, who helped us gather scene tape. Special thanks also to Susan Schulten, our history advisor, to publications director Sam Bach, to Anne Sneesby Cook for her newspaper and periodical research, and to Lori Bailey, our problem solver extraordinaire. Thanks to our volunteer transcribers for this season, Clint Carlson, Barry Levine, Ivy Martinez, Aaron Wilcox, and Sharon Zimmerman. If you'd like to see a transcript of any of our episodes, either as a matter of accessibility or because you'd like to use Lost Highways in your classroom, you can find them at historycolorado.org/Lost Highways. Devin James Fry composed the music for this episode, and our theme is by Connor Bergal. Many thanks to our editorial team, Sean Boyd, Kimberly Cronwall, Angel Vigil, and Eric Carpio, and to our advisory group, Stephen Sturm, Emily Sturm, Thomas Andrews, Jonathan Futa, Charlie Woolley, Susan Schulten, Tom Romero, and Cara DeGette. Finally, a huge thanks to the entire staff at History Colorado, and thank you for listening. I'm Noel Black.